Okay, so we may start. We are a little bit in delay, but the plenary session was going long, and therefore we will start immediately. We have here three presentations. I suggest, my idea is to let each presentation to complete and then reserve a sort of plenary discussion at the end of the third, so that we do not have any interruption in between. Each of you will have around 15 minutes. And so we may start with the first one, who is Professor Farina. Mirko Farina is an assistant professor of philosophy today in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Science at the Innopolis University. And he was also research fellow at St. Petersburg State University and the honorary research fellow at the King's College in London. And it is also representing Italy and the Global Health and COVID-19 Task Force 1 at the G20 in this year. Today, Professor Farina will present a speech about Not So Human, why the quarantine model of incapacitation fails to be the best criminal policy. So, Professor Farina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes, I can hear you, and I hope also the other participants.
Thank you. Okay, so, well, my name is Mirko, as you said. I'm a philosopher and a computer scientist, and it's a pleasure to be delivering this talk today. Right, we don't have much time, so we better get into the main business of this talk. So a few remarks before we start. So this talk comes out of a co-authored paper, which is currently under review. Now, here you see a rough summary of the paper, on these slides. Unfortunately, well, owing it to lack of time, a problem you may also face, well, I won't be able to discuss all these single points that I put in these slides. So I will just try to provide you with a brief synthesis of our contribution, because the paper is co-authored. Okay, so what I will be doing. So I will start by presenting very briefly the quarantine model and its crucial tenets. Then I'm going to skip the intermediate section here, essentially the literature review, and I will just present one of our objections to the quarantine model. Then I will problematize around such an objection, eventually drawing some conclusion about the alleged humanity of such a model. Okay, so you might not be familiar about this model. So what is the quarantine model? Well, it's a model of incapacitation of wrongdoers or criminals, which is applied to criminal justice, and it was originally developed by this guy, there, Perbon. So what is the fundamental premise underlying this model? Well, the fundamental premise underlying this model, as you can see from the slide here, is that of free will skepticism. So in other words, advocates of this view, of this account, believe that people shouldn't be held morally responsible for their the actions they commit, because essentially they're not free. They are determined in their action, in their behaviors. So why is this premise important for this model? Well, because it calls, according to its proponents, for a reform of retributive justice, and therefore contributes to establish two of the central tenets of this model, which are listed here in the slides. First one, the idea that offenders shouldn't be detained in harsh conditions. The second one, the idea that they should be given an opportunity for rehabilitation. So the overall idea is that rehabilitative confinement is more humane than simply putting people in prison. Now, you may wonder why this model is called the quarantine model. Well, it's called the quarantine model because the idea is borrowed, so to speak, from the epidemiological process of quarantining people. So like we quarantine potentially infected people to prevent diseases from spreading, advocates of this model claim that we ought to preventively detain dangerous individuals to prevent crimes from occurring. So, of course, here I cannot go in details, but Pereboom did some work to establish this the similarity between these two apparently seemingly different processes. And you can see some of the similarities that he has claimed that subsist in order to establish this proposal in the slides here. You can read it. I don't have time to get through this in detail. So, but more or less, I hope you got the gist of the model, yeah? So now, this model recently has been further developed by this guy, another philosopher, American philosopher. His name is Greg Caruso, who has framed this model within a broader justificatory framework, that of public health ethics. And in fact, he has called his model the public health quarantine model. Now, what's the difference between these two models? There are very, very few, very little. They both rely on the principle of least infringement, which basically holds that the restrictive measures ought to be taken in order to protect the private safety and the public society. However, perhaps that's the only minor difference in nuances between Caruso's model and Pereboom's one, is the fact that the latter, the former, so Caruso's model, is kind of asking us to take the necessary steps to prevent quarantining from occurring in the first place. So perhaps more than Pereboom's, this model emphasized the humanitarian goal of remedying social and economic inequalities, which are considered triggering factors of crimes. So to sum up, roughly, Pereboom and Caruso both believe that the right to arm in self-defense and defense of others justifies incapacitating the criminally dangerous with the minimum arm required for protection. Their model focuses on the well-being of criminals, on prevention, on social justice, and demands us to take actions against the social determinants of criminal behavior. Sounds all good, right? Well, it sounds good in theory, but many objections have been raised against this model by very important philosophers. Here are some of the biggest names that have attacked this model. And in truth, many of these objections have been fended off by Pereboom and Caruso, who have aptly replied. Now, as I mentioned when I started this talk, I'm not interested here in looking at the dialectic between these objections because I don't have time. So I will not be looking at this today. Apologies for this, but we really don't have time. So what I will be doing instead is quickly, very roughly presenting or trying to present what I think is one of our objections, the most important objection that we can raise against this model. Namely, the fact that the quarantine model lacks a reliable way of determining who is dangerous. And this conclusion, which I hope I'll be able to establish, it's kind of make this model, if it goes through, undesirable, in the sense that it will not be, if applied to society, follow the humanitarian purpose for which it was designed. Yeah. So, however, in order to establish this conclusion, as you can see from the slides, we need to demonstrate two claims. Claim one, that the quarantine model does not have the tool to deal with recidivism. And claim two, that basically the probabilistic approach to recidivism that the quarantine model suggests does raise some important ethical concerns. Yeah. So, in order to demonstrate our conclusion that the model is undesirable, we need to demonstrate these claims. Let's see if we can manage to do so. So recall again, the quarantine model has two very important and worthy outcomes. Yeah, the first, to eliminate needless detention for non-dangerous offenders. The second, to reduce serious societal harms by prolonging the quarantine of only dangerous individuals. Yeah. Now, this is good, but the quarantine model, I think, can achieve such outcomes and therefore become more humane than retributivism only and only if it manages to reliably assess the level of future readiness of possible offenders. Why? Because without such a mechanism in place, criminals could either spend too much time in prison or too less. If it's the former, then the model ends up being unnecessarily cruel and brutal. If it's the latter, then the model fails to achieve protections for self-defense and public safety. Therefore, it's useless. Yeah. So the quarantine model can be humane only and only if it can be more humane than retributivism, only and only if it can reliably assess the criminal readiness of potential offenders. So the question is, can it do so then? Well, I would try to argue that it cannot do so. How I'm going to try to demonstrate this? Well, let's compare the two processes of quarantining criminals on the one hand and the epidemiological process of quarantining infected people. So we are all familiar with the latter. The pandemic told us much about this. So what can we say about these two processes? Well, we can certainly say that medical knowledge and diagnostic tools allow doctors to make well-informed, pretty accurate decisions with respect to epidemiological cases. So, for instance, people who have been exposed to the virus need to be quarantined. Those people have to be kept in quarantine until the incubation period is passed, or at least until a test is proven, is shown that demonstrates that the person is negative, and so on. On the other hand, those who test positive to the test or who display symptoms are isolated, and they're kept in isolation for the time that they are contagious. Yeah. All in all, it seems that there are very reliable ways in which doctors could know how sufficient, with sufficient certainty, how and when a patient is virus-free. Yeah. Unfortunately, this level of certainty does not seem to accompany judicial decision to release a person from quarantine. This can be at best estimated, gauged based on averages. Yes. So of course there are some exceptions. You know, take a terrorist who was declared that he will continue fighting if released. Yeah, that's an exception. Take a psychopath who has certain brain damage which forces him to perform the acts he does, the vicious act that he does. Of course, there is a reliable way to know this. But for most of the criminals, for most wrongdoers, their future readiness is not reliably predictable. So, as you all know, so in other words, there's no reliable way to assess with certainty whether the person could reoffend. So, as you all know, all criminals during the trial, most of them at least confess their crimes, regret what they have done, and promise they will never do it again. Later, some of them will reoffend, some of them will not. However, no test or procedure or textbook in criminology can ever tell us how long would it be needed to keep that person incapacitated in order for him or her to be rehabilitated. Thus, unlike the epidemiological cases we discussed earlier on, there seems to be no reliable tests to use, no practice, no established practice to adopt, no manuals to read in order to determine whether the offender will commit a new crime in the future. Yeah, and if that is the case, then it means that this model cannot be more humane because it can risk into putting into isolation and therefore confine innocent people who shouldn't be in isolation. That would go against the ethical tenets that made the model appear in the first place. So basically, this is the possible objection that you can run against this model. Now, let's briefly try to imagine how Peereboom and Caruso could reply. Yeah? So Peereboom and Caruso perhaps may object that in the future neural tests for violent tendencies will be developed, and that on the grounds of this test we will be able to pretty much identify these dangerous individuals, yeah? And therefore to establish with greater accuracy whether someone is likely to commit a crime in the future. How can we respond to this objection? Well, at the moment, it's a bit like fantasy, we do not have such tests available. We're not sure they might be developed. And even if they will be developed, we're not sure whether they fulfill the promise for which they have been developed. So I wouldn't be particularly worried about this objection. However, Peereboom and Caruso may rejoin and may have a stronger objection, may say, may suggest introducing risk assessment tools. They are used around the world in many different disciplines, and they could say, such methods could be adopted to criminal justice and could employ algorithms, big data analysis, statistical estimation to assign a probability of reoffending to an individual based on the risk factors that are associated to his or her profile. Now, this looks like a more realistic objection, I would say, but still, it is not how to say, well, there is an ongoing debate, a very heated debate about the fairness and accuracy of such methods and about whether or not we should be adopting in criminal justice. Among criminologists, there is such a debate. So it is not a given that such methods should be used, necessarily be used, yeah? So I think that at minimum, Perelman and Caruso should acknowledge the problematicity of this idea, yeah? But more generally, I'm worried that the adoption of this probabilistic nature that underlies the statistical methods, well, it might be problematic because it will inevitably lead to incarcerating some of the individuals who would not have reoffended. So, in other words, you know, it would raise significant ethical concerns. What do I mean by this? Well, basically this: if we detain people on probability, yeah, for how high this can be, well, it means that we are prepared to limit the liberty of some people, non-dangerous people, for the sake of public safety. So basically, we are prepared to not imprison, but to confine or isolate, as a mistake, perhaps, innocent people. Now, you can appreciate that this is a very problematic idea. Yeah. Now, perhaps Perelman and Caruso may say that this detention is justified for self-defense, yeah, in line with their original tenet. However, this seems to justify detention on utilitarianist grounds, which Perelman and Caruso elsewhere rejects. So I think there is a dilemma for them to answer here. If they go this way, they seem to contradict the principle of minimal harm. If they don't go this way, well, it seems that, you know, their model will raise anyway, in any case, important ethical concerns, which could be only solved by appealing to some utilitaristic perspective, which would entail perhaps a semi-retributivist model, which, however, is not in line with their view. So what can we say? It seems to me that Perelman and Caruso's model works only if we can detain an individual for the right amount of time, as I said earlier on. At present, it's not the case, at least it doesn't seem to me, that there are reliable mechanisms in place to determine how much is enough. So an evidence for this is the discussion that we mentioned earlier on about risk assessment methods, but also more practically, more trivially, perhaps, the fact that, you know, parole boards and judges constantly, everyday struggle with solving with these issues in real life, in daily life. Yeah. So we saw that Perelman and Caruso could perhaps embrace utilitarianism to get off of this impasse. So justify the incarceration, confinement, so to speak, of innocent people by appealing to public safety, the right of self-defense. However, this would kind of contradict the utilitarianist perspective that Perelman and Caruso have attacked elsewhere. So it seems to me that this model, while being great in theory and very humane in theory, then it seems to defeat the humanitarian goal for which it has been kind of developed when you applied it in practice. And yeah, this is the very short talk that I had.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Farina. I mean, have some questions, but I will postpone my questions at the end. And therefore, we may move straight ahead with the second presentation, which will be delivered by Professor Young. Professor Young has graduated from the Yonsei University College of Law, and now she joined the Department of Medical Laws and Ethics at the Yonsei University. And it is also a research assistant in the Asian Institute of Bioethics and Health Law, where she is doing her research about neuroethics and education. And today she will present a speech about the patent trends of brainwave technology in the Republic of Korea and its ethical and social implications. So, Professor Young, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As you introduced me, my name is Jiyeon Yang from Seoul, Korea. I'm glad to meet you all. I will introduce part of a neuroethics research project funded by the Korean National Research Foundation, which was conducted in 2019, actually. This research aims to understand the patent trends associated with the brainwave technology and analyze their ethical and social implications. Although there are differences between patent registration status and commercialization of products in the actual market, we assume that the list of registered patents are an important indicator to show the trends by which technology is developing. In 2019, the main research theme of our project was non-invasive neuromodulation. Accordingly, at first, the scope of patent research included not only brainwaves, but also TDCS and TMS. However, we found that the number of patents related to the TDCS, TMS were relatively small. Thus, we narrowed down the scope of technology to brainwaves. We used the WIPS-ON, a patent database search engine established by a Korean company in order to easily customize search keywords both in Korean and English. The search keywords were brainwave and EEG and neurofeedback. We searched for registered patents between 2010 to 2019. Initially, 491 results matching this condition were found. Then either duplicate or irrelevant results were manually removed. After this filtering process, the number of cases that we analyzed was 310. Over the last 10 years, there were slight declines in 2012 and 2018, but the number of patent registrations has steadily increased. In particular, almost 80% of patents were registered in the last 5 years during 2015 to 2019. Then this is the number of registered patents according to the main original IPC. IPC means International Patent Classification Code. To give a brief introduction of the contents of the patents, first, the majority of registered items are related to diagnosis of brain disorders or monitoring mental states using brainwaves. Second, another feature of the search result was that mental wellness appears to be attracting more attention. Not only measurement of attention level or memory function, but also mental care using neurofeedback technologies are increasing. The largest number of patents were under the code of G6F, which refers to electric digital data processing. And among this category, -3/1 is concerned with input arrangements or combined into and output arrangements for interaction between user and computer, which means computer interface, brain-computer interface. Here are examples of patents whose main IPC is this one. In these cases, brainwaves are used to control external objects like phones and driving, or chair, smart glasses, or home appliances. And similarly, -1900 is related to digital computing or data processing equipment or methods. as you can see, these are typical instances of BCIs centering around mental health, like depression or insomnia and epileptic seizures. Then in this category, the -21 is related to security arrangements for protecting computers or components thereof, programs or data against unauthorized activity. And 21/32 is using biometric data. So these categories are related to user authentication by Brainwave. I think these technologies are a crucial part of BCI technology applications. And the next is A16B, refers to measuring for diagnostic purpose. And A16B-B is concerned with measuring bioelectric signals of body or parts thereof. In other words, those technologies, practical applications of EEG or biofeedback for diagnosis are under the categories of A16B-B, like cognitive state perception, or so on. And that /048 is related to brain fingerprinting and detecting light, or Alzheimer's disease, or seizure detection and PTSD diagnostic systems. And A61M refers to devices for introducing media into or onto the body. And /00 is related to cause and change in the state of consciousness, and whereas /02 is related to inducing sleep or relaxation. And as you can see, these categories are related to concentration and attention improvement or prevention of sleepiness, and like concentrations and so on. But in this category, there are sleep-inducing or healing users' anxiety or depression and so on. So to sum up, this study shows that brainwave technologies are utilized mainly for diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders or depression and so on. However, the purpose of using brainwaves is not limited to disease control. Furthermore, target users of brainwave devices are lay people as well as medical professionals. So these devices are evolving into a daily life item for monitoring and modulating brain conditions such as concentration, attention, or training, and even controlling light apparatus. In this sense, the brainwave data is not mere medical data anymore. It contains more than health-related information. Considering these patent trends, the ethical use and application of brainwave technologies could be discussed in two ways. First, discussion should concern the necessity of brain data governance, as such data is more frequently generated in daily lives by ubiquitous means such as wearable devices linked with motor vehicles, home IoT devices, and so on. The brain data is more than just medical data. Therefore, it could become much more complex data in terms of applying specific legal regulations. Sometimes it may fall outside the margin of legal protections. According to the Korean Personal Information Protection Law, medical information is classified as sensitive data that requires intense protection, whereas biometric data is classified as sensitive data only when such data are used for user authentication. This is why, even though the brain data generates more sensitive and predictive values, which are pursued by commercial businesses, the existing legal system is insufficient to cope with these changes. Second, if mental care device helps maintain one's healthy mental status in a meaningful way, using the device might suggest moral responsibility. For analogy, if someone has impaired vision, he or she is expected to complement their eyesight condition by using glasses or contact lenses while driving. They can't excuse their poor vision if there is a car accident. Like this, therefore, to some point, it may be helpful to address the safety of social environments, such as skyscraper construction labor, by monitoring attention levels. Perhaps someone may argue that it is necessary to regard attention monitoring as a mandatory measure to safeguard employees and other co-workers as well. However, the matter is how to balance the workplace safety and privacy of employees. How to prevent irrelevant use or unwanted leakage of brain data are matters. Of course, consumer-based brainwave devices are still in developmental stages. Overall, as anticipatory endeavors of LC research, envisioning the ways of ethical incorporation of brainwave technologies in daily life should lead to much discussion of these crucial aspects. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Yun. And I also have some questions for you, but I will postpone them. So we may go to the next presentation, which will be delivered by Professor Battaglia, who is assistant professor at the Faculty of Philosophy at the Ludwig Maximilians Universität, Munich, and she's also permanent visiting lecturer at the medical school here in Italy of the University of Pisa. And she was also a senior lecturer in the Humboldt Universität in Berlin. And today she will present do ethical issues regarding brain organoids rely on the metaphysics of the mind-brain identity theory? ? So we have to listen in order to identify if, who will be the answer to that question. So Professor Battaglia, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you very well.
Okay, thank you then. So my topic today is organoid research, consciousness, moral status, and how they relate, with the ethical governance of organoid research. So then what I will try to do is to distinguish the different thematic strands of the epistemological and the ethical constellations that are controversial in quite different discourses. And I will try then to demonstrate the connection between them, which is not provided in the distinct discourses. And therefore, at the end, so my conclusion will be a kind of paradoxical conclusion. So first of all, let me introduce, present what organoids are. So you are likely to be familiar with this kind of innovation. I do know, but nevertheless, I will just say a few words on this because So they are a very intriguing kind of innovation. So this is a presentation by the European Commission. There is a results pack on organoids research, and this characterization comes from this pack. And they say producing miniature, I don't know, okay. Producing miniature versions of organs in a dish may sound like science fiction, but thanks to advances in stem cell technology and bioengineering, scientists are now able to artificially grow a mass of cells into organoids with similar properties to organs. And as you can imagine, so cerebral organoids, brain organoids, are the most interesting sort of these miniature versions of organs. And this is a very interesting observation, they do not exist in vivo, they just exist in vitro. And I am indebted with Eleonora Buzzanca because we were together in a research group, and this was her point. I'm not sure that this is relevant for the ethical governance, but it's very important for the characterization of organoids. And along with the other disruptive research, this is not just one sort of disruptive research. Organoids challenge the conceptual, ontological, and regulative dualism between persons and things. I think this is another point which is very relevant for the governance. This is my abstract, but I don't need to read it. You may be already familiar with this. Instead, I read aloud this quotation by the book by Philip Ball, How to Grow a Human, because I think he can display the right attitude against brain organoids. And he says, there was no rule book to tell me how I should feel about my mini brain. Certainly, I didn't lie awake at night fretting over its welfare. Its welfare. This mass of tissue made from my skin didn't take on the status of an individual, but I felt oddly fond of those cells doing their best to fulfill a role in the absence of the guiding influence of their somatic source. There was a curious intimacy involved, a sense of potential that wasn't present initially in the teeny chunk of arm flesh excised and placed in a test tube. This was more than a matter of cells subsisting. This was life in all its teeming, multiplying glory, spilling out from a pairing of me. And this is Ball. So then I will not in this presentation address the condition under which sentient brain organoids might arise. I will start from this claim from Lavazza and Massimini 2018, and this will be my starting point as well. And in this paper, I just want to complement their claim. So they say we need a general theory of consciousness that attempts to explain what experience is and what type of physical system can have it. So they say in order to have an ethical governance of organoid research, we need to think about the epistemology of organoids. So I agree with them. Only there is some trouble because, as we know, there is some controversy about consciousness. We can distinguish at least three main positions. So most philosophers are confident that consciousness is an entirely physical phenomenon. So they have a physicalist and reductivist view on consciousness. Then there is a minority which argues for dualism. So we have David Chalmers, or Martina Nidarumelin, or Donald Davidson. And we also have some other position, pan-psychistic position defended by David Goff in his 2018 book by Oxford University Press. So we don't need to deal with the hard problem of consciousness. We just need to address the question of phenomenal consciousness, because this is relevant to the connection with the moral status. And so the claim is that it seems obvious that phenomenal consciousness is something of great value, and that this value maps onto a range of important ethical issues. This is not, there are some objections on this. So one of this objection is by Julian Savulescu, but I'm not going to discuss this, maybe in the Q&A section. So here you have the definition of phenomenal consciousness. So the feature, I would like to define the phenomenal consciousness using a phrase made famous by Nagel, and that is that the feature or aspect is that there is something it is like for you to undergo these mental states, events, and processes. And this is the definition of a moral status, because which is important for me is the relationship, so the connection between the consciousness and the moral status. And so this is here is my view, that brain organoids do not have phenomenal consciousness, also because they do not have a perceptual apparatus through which they could experience the world. And I wouldn't like to deny, I am not going to deny that brain processes contribute causally to perception. Such processes are simply but not part of the perceiver's experience. So they do not belong to the phenomenal consciousness. So brain, maybe in other words, we can state that brain organoids lack sensory input and motor output, and it might be thought that even highly sophisticated brain organoids will never develop the capacity to feel or think, and will therefore never develop moral status. So maybe here is relevant the claim by Leonora Buzanca. They are something which is a thing that just exists in vitro, but they don't exist in vivo. And now, so then the conclusion, if we try to tie phenomenal consciousness to moral status, we will have different results depending on the endorsed theory of consciousness. So in particular, we may end up with unduly restricting their use in research in the case of physicalist theory of consciousness. So if you are going to endorse the physicalist theory of consciousness, we need to restrain the research, the organoid research. In the case of non-reductive views, such as theory of phenomenal consciousness, so Chalmers, Nidarumelin, Davidson, so this kind of naturalistic dualism, consciousness is not an entirely physical phenomenon. So brain organisms do not exhibit phenomenal consciousness, therefore they don't have a moral status. So, and then we can have a more liberal governance of organoid research. And this is therefore we have divergent ethical governance depending on the theoretical framework adopted in order to state consciousness. And this is the paradoxical outcome, because by endorsing physicalist and materialist theory of consciousness, so we have a more restrictive kind of ethical governance And this is not what we would expect from this kind of theory, which are inspired by a more scientific kind of attitude. And so this is actually the claim and the result of my paper today. Thank you, Claire. So then you have some references of the paper.
Thank you very much also to you, Professor Battaglia, and we have finished with the presentation, so there is enough time now to open a little debate. And just to start, I have a couple of questions, and one for each of our colleagues, and then if there are other participants who want to ask something, or if you have some question to the other speakers, each speaker has to the other one. Very briefly, for you, Professor Farina, I was wondering, what will be a sort of point of equilibrium, which means probably may we consider the Italian model, which is mixed between prisons and security measures, a good way to try to find a point of equilibrium between the quarantine and the non-quarantine regime, because of course we have still a strong debate here in Italy about the retributivism of punishments. The society in general is more retributivist than probably the courts, or at least the Constitutional Court, for example, about life imprisonment. It's said it is unconstitutional because it does not consider the capability of the person to change, to be re-educated. So my question is, could the Italian model be a sort of point of equilibrium or not in your idea?
Yeah, I appreciate that, that model, the quarantine model, has been developed mostly in reference to the US. And in the US, as we all know, they have peculiar laws, let's say like this, yeah, and they target usually specific people. So, that said, even if I raise criticism against that model, I do not think that it's utterly wrong. I still think that it's a good model. It's a good model. It's like a bit like communism, it's a very good idea, but then when you implement it in society, it may raise some issues. So I don't know what is exactly what is the, it's a question that goes beyond me, beyond my knowledge and understanding what is the best model. I certainly think that probably a balance between retributivism and like the kind of, incapacitation, let's say, put it this way, that Perbum and Caruso put forward would be desirable for society, and would not incur in some of those contradictions, I think, that seem to affect Perbum and Caruso's model. So probably, if you ask me, that just my personal opinion doesn't count anything. I'm not a criminologist, I'm not a legal scholar, I do philosophy of cognitive science, not even, mostly. For me, it would be better to kind of complement these two things. Yeah. So, of course, take on board the humanitarian purpose of rehabilitation, but what I find very problematic is the premise for the quarantine model. So the idea that we're not free. That is something that, kind of justifies that model, but I think it's very problematic from my point of view. So if you adhere to that premise, you may note in the criticism that I develop, I didn't mention this. We developed, I didn't mention this. So we are taking for granted the premise that free will skepticism is right. We are working from that. We are pointing at anomalies or contradictions from that premise, but that premise is very much questionable. As you know, there is a centuries-old debate about that. So in trying to develop this criticism, we kind of already were very fair towards Perbum and Caruso, I think, because the very premises from which they start their view, it's very controversial, and we didn't address that at all. We took it for granted.
Yeah, and so the outcomes could be paradoxical as well, because in a way it seems to be more human, but as you told in your presentation, it might be less human. Yeah.
So I mean, it's difficult to scale this up. You know, it's difficult to, I would say, to measure it, because, but there are certainly some cases, and you know, that case that I think we pointed out in the presentation are exemplary, paradigmatic cases of people who would be put into confinement, or whatever you don't want to call it, prison. It's not prison, it's confinement or isolation, but you know, they do not deserve this. And if you justify this for self-protection or protection of society, it means that you're adopting a utilitarianist ground, which is very similar to retributivism, which is the starting point, the controversial point which they wanted to attack. So, as I said, I think in theory, their model sounds very promising, very interesting, but in practice, it runs against many difficulties, which threatens, I think, its validity. At least if they want to be consistent with what they say. Yeah.
Yeah, great. My further question will be for you, Professor Yun Yang. If I understood correctly, you said that probably the Korean legal system. I'm a constitutional lawyer, so I'm looking your presentation from the point of view of the lawyer. You said that probably the legal framework in Korea is insufficient to protect the rights of the individual against an abuse of the brainwaves technology. And there is a huge debate worldwide about the introduction of a sort of right to the freedom of the cognitive freedom. But now my question is a little bit different. Do you consider, or in general, the Korean framework considers or attributes some legal value to an expression of will made by those brain-computer interfaces? Because in Italy, there were a couple of cases where a sort of those instruments were used, or at least theoretically more than practically, but they might be used in order to express a legal will. For example, a sort of to be disconnected by from a cardiopulmonary ventilator or something like that. So the point is, do you consider, or the Korean framework considers some legal value to the expression of will through the BCI? Or not?
Oh, thank you for asking a very interesting question. As I understand, you are asking, your question is whether brainwave data can be interpreted into his or her real.
Yeah, exactly. If they can be considered, like, for example, a sort of instrument for communication, and if that type of communication has or not a legal value, or could have.
If someone has a will, and you mean before that?
Yeah, I mean, let us suppose that I have to write my living will, or I have to take a decision, for example, to be treated in a hospital in a way or in another. May I use legally a brain-computer interface to express my will, to express my thoughts with a legal value?
I understand. And in Korean civil law, will has a very strict requirements to to be acknowledged as a legal value. So the one is writing, and the other case is speech.
Yeah,
so
like
there is at least there is no cases like using BCIs so far, but maybe later we might consider those processes of BCIs after we can at least acknowledge the precisely and accuracy of the BCI technologies.
Okay, thank you. And finally, for you, Professor Battaglia, I think that, I mean, I agree with you as a lawyer again, because probably even if we do not have yet any, I mean, case law or any act or legal norm specifically dedicated to the brain organoids, I think that probably we have to consider a sort of, as you said, a sort of person embodied. I mean, even if we know that the legal death occurs when the old brain function are definitely teased, the presumption is a brain in a body. So I think that we cannot consider, at least under a legal point of view, to attribute legal personhood and therefore legal rights to, I mean, only brain cells, even if they may show some electrical activity, because they are disembodied. I don't know if there's, I mean, a legal point of view fits or not with your theoretical point, but at least I agree with you. I mean, we cannot consider only a physicalist.
So then, if I understand you correctly, you are saying that we cannot reason analogically to the vegetative status, for example.
Yeah.
So then we cannot have the same ethical treatment for brain organoids drawing on the experience with the vegetative status.
Yeah, I mean, my point is that probably we cannot attribute to the brain organoids some, I mean, personhood, and therefore some limitations upon research as if they were humans, notwithstanding they present some brain activity, because they are disembodied.
Yeah.
I mean, we can probably, we cannot use, I mean, the analogy of the embryo, because the embryo is at least under constitutional, it also European law, an embryo is considered capable to develop into a full human body. But that is not the case of a brain organoid, and at the same time they are disembodied. So they cannot be considered, I mean, equivalent to a persistent vegetative state.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, a persistent vegetative state is the result of a human body which has been deprived of consciousness. On the contrary, the brain organoids still do not have a body.
Yeah,
and they did not have a body in the past before, like the vegetative.
Yeah, and this is a very good point. And I think, so the other point is that they just exist in vitro. So they don't really get something existing in reality. So, but so it's complicated. So I still have a question for the other two speakers.
Yeah, please.
And so the first question is for let me see, for Professor Farina. And
just call me Mirko, it's okay.
Okay. So I am very sympathetic with the non-retributivism, but the problem is that I am very sympathetic with free will, also with free will. And
so you see.
My question is a very simple one. So do I need to challenge free will in order to join or to defend non-retributivism?
Well, let's say that there's no obligation here on my side, so I guess we are free to choose what we want to believe and do. So there's no normative requirement on our action from my side. But the idea is that if you normally those philosophers or those people, scientists, whatever, who defend free will skepticism, well, not all of them, but most of them, they end up siding with this humanitarian perspective. Yeah. On the other hand, those that oppose determinisms, they tend to side with, at least if not with retributivism, with some sort of kind of semi-retributivist model that tries to, of course, no one is like, nowadays saying that we should keep, very few people, and certainly not in academia, that we should keep people, whatever, put them in jail, throw out the key or whatever. So yeah, I would say that yeah, if you endorse the former, so free will skepticism, you're likely to endorse also the quarantine model. Although I'm not sure if it's a necessary inference. If you, on the other end, by free will, then you're likely to be held responsible for your own actions. Therefore, if you're responsible for your own action, you should be accountable for your own action, which means that some tools, or society has to develop some tools in order to, make people abide to laws. There can be deterrence in the form of some sort of retributive practice or semi-retributive practice, but I think there's no escape from that.
Yeah, thank you. And I do have another question for Yun Yang, very brief one. So you are worried about this ubiquitous exploitation of these new technologies in Korea, and so you said that these data are not anymore medical data, but they are health data, and therefore they are somehow connected with the privacy and with the private sphere of the individuals. So my question is, are you more worried about some kind of manipulation of the people, or with the surveillance of the people in Korea?
You mean manipulation, and the other one was what?
Surveillance, because they are the two kind of for instance, of European Union, as these two, they are two high-risk kind of technologies.
Yes, I'm worried about in commercial parts, they are trying to predict consumers' behavior. Mm-hmm. So like Pokemon Go, have you ever heard that Pokemon Go is originated from Google, and they wanted to induce consumers' behavior to step by step, because they're while they are playing their games, they are exposed to the commercial without noticing. So I think brain data might be manipulated or exploited for the same purpose. Like and also the another problem that I worrying about is many devices are trying to connect their users' data to the SNS, social media, like Facebook or Twitter. If so, their data is linked to so many data, and then those data generates more and more predictive values for, it has an enormous value of commercial purpose. So I think those use of data is outside of legal protection now. So if like Cambridge Analytica case, like Facebook, I think brain data could be used in the same way if we don't have a proper preparation for those uses. So yeah. Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Okay, so we may. I think that we may close the session so that we may attend on time the next plenary session, which will be the INS panel. at 8 p.m. about ethical and societal implications of telepsychiatry. And again, thank you very much to all our presenters. And it was a great and very interesting session. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye.